So I'll talk about an experimental mission that we did last hurricane season. And the idea was to send some uncrewed surface ocean vehicles called sail drones into hurricanes in the Western Atlantic and the Caribbean Sea. So this was a big team effort between AOML, PMEL, and the sail drone team, which is based out in California. We also had good partnerships with the University of Georgia, IUS, and Remote Sensing Systems. So briefly, the challenges, kind of the motivation for this work. We know that hurricane intensity prediction has seen uneven progress. It hasn't advanced a lot compared to the track forecasts. So, and especially rapid intensification is a top priority. It's very difficult to predict. The top plot there, you can see that the probability of detection of rapid intensification in the Atlantic, so defined as an increase in maximum wind speed of 20 knots or more in 24 hours or less, is currently on average about 20%, so pretty low probability of predicting just whether rapid intensification will occur, and it hasn't advanced a lot. So to improve forecasts, we need improved understanding of processes in hurricanes, and this can lead to better parameterizations and models to improve forecasts. An example is the drag coefficient, which you can see in the bottom plot there, which has a lot of uncertainty if you look at the spread of the values for winds greater than 25 or 30 meters per second, so getting up into hurricane strength. So we need improved forecasts and also better ocean atmosphere initial conditions for models. So the idea was to get some new measurements from sail drone. This is the extreme weather sail drone, and it's about 20 feet long. It's about 10 feet high. There's a rigid sail, which is actually more like an airplane wing. So it has a little tab on it, and it can change the angle relative to the wind. So the wind steers it, and it's powered by solar radiation. The sensors are powered by solar radiation, and it measures a lot of different parameters in the ocean and the atmosphere. You can see some of them listed there. This is a little bit different from a standard sail drone, which you can see on the bottom left. So the design's different. It has a shorter sail, the extreme weather version, and it has a lower center of mass, and also the sensors are more rugged. And the idea is that this new version, built more for stability, would be able to withstand the really intense conditions inside of a major hurricane near the surface of the ocean. But we hadn't done this before, so this was the first attempt to do this. So our plan for the hurricane season last year, we basically, the most important thing, we wanted to put them where we had the best chance of getting into tropical storm and hurricane force winds. So we looked at a probability map here. The colors here show the probability of tropical storm force winds are higher for each location on the map based on data over 20 years for the peak of the hurricane season. So we put one of the sail drones kind of in the northwestern area there, that gray box in the subtropics, where there's a high chance of strong winds, and another one in the southeast area, that gray box. And that one, you can see there are more dark gray lines, and these dark gray lines indicate category 4 and 5 hurricanes that have gone through there in the past. So that one was more positioned for stronger hurricane, hopefully. And then the red boxes, the other 3 sail drones that we deployed, those were where there were ocean gliders. So that kind of dictated where we put them to get co-located measurements with ocean gliders. And then, so the black dots are surface moorings, NDBC surface moorings. And we compared, whenever possible, we compare the sail drone data to the data from the buoys to kind of to validate it. That's always important to do. And finally, the pink contours are strong ocean currents, 50 centimeters per second or more. You can see the Gulf Stream, and then there's some eddies to the east of the Gulf Stream. So this was a consideration, and actually complicated sometimes the positioning of the sail drones. So that's what we planned, and this is what we actually did during the hurricane season. So it's pretty close to the plan. We're pretty happy with that. So we had the squiggly lines here, the colored more squiggly lines are the paths of the 5 sail drones that they took, and the colors indicate the 1-hour wind speed measured by the sail drone. So mostly pretty weak winds. the purple and the blue. And I mentioned that we had gliders, so the pink lines show the tracks of ocean gliders, where we got co-located measurements with the sail drones north and south of Puerto Rico and off the US East Coast, so that worked out well. And so the smooth colored lines are the tracks of 6 different tropical cyclones that passed close to the sail drones. And the strongest one was Hurricane Sam, which went over the easternmost sail drone there. And I'll talk a lot about this in my presentation later. And finally, so the red dots are NDBC buoys that we compared to, and the dark, little smaller dots near Puerto Rico, we had drop-sons deployed from NOAA and NASA aircraft to get co-located measurements of the atmosphere with the sail drones. All right, so I've had questions. I've had a lot of questions about how fast these sail drones can go. So I thought I'd throw in a slide about this, and it really depends on the winds and to the ocean currents to some extent. So this is an example. I'm trying to get one of the sail drones into Tropical Storm Henri, which was in the subtropical North Atlantic. And we had really weak winds beforehand for several days beforehand. So you can see in the upper left plot, the speed over ground of the sail drone was pretty slow, less than ½ meter per second a lot of the time, about 50 kilometers per day. And it was difficult to get it into position to get it to the tropical storm. But then as it got into the winds, then the speed of the sail drone increased up to 2 meters per second. And the red dot shows when it was the closest to the center of the tropical storm. So it was moving pretty fast in the winds and currents. Another example in Hurricane Sam on the right. So on average, it's pretty slow. We're struggling to get the sail drone eastward about ½ meter per second on average. But then when it got into the strong hurricane, the winds took it up to 4 meter per second speed over ground. And you can see a difference here when we were trying to hold it on station here as the hurricane approached. The speeds were lower as the wind speed increased, and the colors are sea surface pressure, atmospheric pressure. And then as the core of the storm went by, we kind of released it and tried to chase the storm, and that's when the speeds were higher. The sail drone speed over ground was higher. So, and I mentioned we coordinated with sail drone, or with gliders and sail drones. So this shows the tracks of the gliders north and south of Puerto Rico, the red line and the blue line, and the green line show the sail drone tracks. So the one south of Puerto Rico, we kind of took a detour to chase a couple tropical storms, and then it went back and coordinated again with the glider. And the point of this is, so on the right, you can see the difference comparing the sea surface temperature on the top and the surface salinity measurements on the bottom between the glider and the sail drone. And the point here is that when they're close together, as you would expect, their measurements agree very well. And as they get farther apart, especially more than 5 kilometers apart, then kind of exponentially the difference in SST and salinity measured between them goes up a lot. And especially south of Puerto Rico, the salinity offsets differences increase a lot because there's a lot more eddies and salinity fronts. So that was an important thing to find out. Ideally, we want to keep them within about 5 kilometers in the future if we can. So that's kind of a piloting challenge for us in the future. All right, so I'll talk mostly about Hurricane Sam for the rest of the presentation, which was definitely the highlight of the mission. So this we knew about 10 days ahead of time, so about September 20th, that some of the prediction models, forecast models, were predicting a tropical wave to come off of Africa and intensify possibly across the Atlantic. So we had good warning, and we moved sail drone 1045 to the east and kind of kept it there. This is the official forecast track 7 days ahead of time, so it was looking pretty good. But it was just a small tropical storm, a weak tropical storm at this point. So it turned out pretty well, and Hurricane Sam intensified into a Category 4 hurricane, and it passed pretty close, the center passed pretty close to the sail drone. That's the blue triangle in the upper left picture, which is a infrared satellite image of Hurricane Sam. So it got pretty close to the eye. The bottom shows the visible image from Sam the day after, a nice, small, well-defined eye. And the real-time 1-minute data from the sail drone is shown on the right. And I'll just point out a couple of highlights. So the wind gusts that it measured got above 125 miles per hour, and this was at a height of about 3.5 meters above the ocean surface. You can see the solar radiation at the surface shot up as it got close to the eye, less cloudiness. Significant wave height reached 14 meters, about 46 feet. And the relative humidity, of course, was very high throughout the storm, and ocean currents got up to about 1 meter per second inside the storm. So we had some discussion recently about whether the sail drone actually went through the strongest part of the hurricane, went through the maximum winds. So we took a look at this synthetic aperture radar image from satellite. And so this was taken a few hours before it went over the sail drone. It's a nice high resolution image of wind speed, 10 meter wind speed. And then you can see the sail drone positions, the yellow and the red dot, and the purple dot is the Hurricane Center's official location of the hurricane when it was close to the sail drone, and the black is the best track path of the hurricane. So I made this little purple line here. So if you kind of translate this up, so this is between the center of the eye and the western edge of the eye wall, translated up to the sail drone, you can see that most likely the very eastern edge of the eye likely passed over the sail drone, which is why we saw the spike up in solar radiation and a little bit of a decrease in wind speed as it went by. So really it went through the kind of the thickest, strongest part of the hurricane, which was good. So we're fortunate. And if it had gone through the eye, it would have gotten a kind of a break. It would have had less winds, weaker winds for a while. So we gave it a good test, sending it through the right side of the storm. So some interesting data. So this is kind of position and orientation data from the sail drone, and it's 20 hertz data, so high resolution. And we can see from the heave data, so the measurement of the height of the sail drone above or below the mean sea level. The maximum that it recorded from trough to crest here was about 27.6 meters. So that's a 90-foot wave that it experienced. It was rolling back and forth side to side quite a lot in the strong winds and the waves. So that's shown in the middle. The red line shows a 90-degree roll. So that's when it's basically probably part of the wing and the sensors potentially were in the water because it was tilted over so far. And that happens a few times. And you can see there's a 180-degree roll here, meaning that it was probably close to upside down in the water at that point. And the pitch wasn't so bad. It's more stable front to back. So the winds, the 1 minute, so these are 1 minute average winds, again, measured at about 3.5 meters in black. So it got up to about 40 meters per second. If we translate them up to 10 meter standard height, then we see winds up to 45 meters per second or so. And if we account for the actual wind measurement height, so because it was rolling so much, sometimes the wind measurement was actually at about 2.5 meters instead of 3 meters. If we account for that, then we see a maximum wind of about 50 meters per second, which is about 112 miles per hour, 1 minute average winds. And we see it's more symmetric now about this decrease in wind speed in the middle. And the gusts got up to about 65 miles per hour, which is 65 meters per second, which is about 145 miles per hour. All right, so we hadn't done this. So there'd never been a sail drone that went through a hurricane or a typhoon and survived and returned data. So we wanted to compare and see if we could trust the data from the sail drone. So there aren't any in situ measurements that we could use to directly compare. So we looked at satellite data. And fortunately, so this is with the Kreitzer Ricciarduli at Remote Sensing Systems. And fortunately, there were some satellite passes that went right over the sail drone when it was near the center of the hurricane. So those are the colored symbols. And the gray shows the sail drone winds converted up to 10 meters to match the satellite measurements. And these are 10-minute averages. So you can see pretty good agreement, actually very good agreement throughout the hurricane. So this gives us confidence in the measurements from the sail drone. And in the upper right, that shows a scatter plot of the data shown in the other plot. And the correlation is close to 1 with very little bias. So again, we have some confidence in these measurements. All right, so that was kind of the background. Now I'll get into some of the results from the analysis that we've been doing. And first looking at the potential role of salinity in the ocean's response to Hurricane Sam. So it went through, actually Hurricane Sam went through kind of an interesting area because it had a low salinity tongue. You can see this low salinity plume here extending up to the north from the Amazon and the Orinoco. And the black is the track of Hurricane Sam. So it went over this northern extent. The red is the sail drone location approximately with the track of Sam. And then we had two Argo profiles, the blue and the orange, that were taken a few days before the hurricane came through. So from these, we can see that the salinity there's a lot of salinity stratification, low salinity and salinity stratification at about 20 to 30 meters. There was actually a temperature inversion that was supported by that salinity stratification, a pretty thick temperature inversion down to about 40 or 50 meters. So the question is, how did this impact the ocean cooling? If we look at the sail drone measurements, on the top, the wind, the SST, and the surface salinity, we can see that, interestingly, SST actually increased a little as the strongest part of the hurricane approached instead of decreasing. And surface salinity in blue, there's a big increase in surface salinity at the same time as the SST was increasing and the winds were very strong. If we look at the mixed layer temperature budget on the bottom, the black shows the rate of change of SST. So positive values show this warming and the negative cooling. And compared to the surface heat fluxes, we can see that obviously the surface heat fluxes can't explain these big changes in SST, which kind of makes sense in a major hurricane. We know that vertical mixing plays a big role. So the idea is that potentially the subsurface ocean conditions affected the mixing and SST response to the hurricane. We had an ADCP on the sail drone, so we can look at the subsurface currents. So the wind speed again shown here, and the wind direction. And as the winds increased and they switched around from the northeast to around from the southwest, this was in resonance with the inertial waves, and it caused really strong inertial oscillations as the core of the hurricane went by. And something interesting is that the current shear, especially for the zonal current, the shear there between the blue and the pink, you can see it's about at 30 meters, which is about where the salinity stratification started, so the mixed layer depth. And the bottom shows the shear squares, so there's kind of a maximum in shear squared there, kind of at the base of the mixed layer, confined to that upper 30 meters where the salinity stratification was. This is a zoom in of the same plots. So the wind, SST, surface salinity, and as the wind increased, SST increased, salinity increased, and the shear, so now you can see the shear is kind of right where the salinity stratification starts, around 20 to 30 meters. And as the winds pick up, you can see this shear squared layer descending rapidly down to at least 50 or 60 meters. And as that happens, it's mixing up warmer water because there's a temperature inversion, and it's mixing up saltier water. We can see this in the SST and SSS, big increase in salinity, increase in SST. So this is what's causing the warming, was the mixing up. And then as it gets down below, the mixed layer gets below 50 meters, then it starts mixing up colder water from the thermocline, and that's when you see the big decrease in SST, the red line in the upper plot. And so how did forecast models get this subsurface ocean impact? We looked at HWRF and RTOFs. So the green is the sail drone SST, and we can see it increasing as the winds increase. The winds are in gray. The models actually show a pretty significant decrease in SST instead of an increase. And why is this? It's because they did not have the salinity stratification. Looking on the right, the blue line is from RTOFs, which is used to initialize HWRF. see hardly any salinity plume. The salinity is much higher than observed from the sail drone. And there's not much of an increase as the storm goes by compared to the sail drone. So it didn't get this salinity stratification or the temperature inversion, and as a result, there was too much cooling in the model, which would be a negative feedback on the hurricane's intensity. And we did some 1D ocean model experiments to kind of validate this, which we initialized with temperature and salinity profiles from the Argo profiles that I showed you earlier, those Argo floats. We forced it with the 1-minute winds and surface heat flux and satellite rainfall. We did 4 different experiments. So we had 2 different Argo profiles, and each one of them we do a model run, a control run with the observed salinity and temperature, and then a experiment where we take out the salinity stratification and we take out the temperature inversion. And that's what it looks like, the initial conditions. So the control is the solid lines, where you can see the temperature inversion in the green and blue plots on top. And the experiment is where we take out the temperature inversion, the dashed lines on the top plots. The bottom is salinity, so control, you can see the salinity stratification, and then we take out all the salinity stratification for the initial conditions in the experiments. And this shows the results. So the control run, the SST from the model, you can see it doesn't decrease much and actually increases a little. And the model initialized with the profiles without salinity, without the temperature inversion, you can see much more cooling. Now it's similar to actually the prediction model, a lot more SST cooling. And the difference is shown on the bottom. So about ½ a degree more cooling if we don't have that salinity effect in the model. The colors are the wind speed. So this happened during the core of the hurricane. This is the strongest winds. The red colors here are 40, 50 meter per second winds. So this could have an important impact potentially on the intensity. And we can estimate this using potential intensity theory. So this says that the maximum sustained wind speed in a hurricane cubed equals the SST underneath the hurricane minus the outflow temperature up in the tropopause times the surface enthalpy flux, latent and sensible heat flux, and inversely proportional to the wind drag coefficient, CD. So this is a heat engine, basically heat engine, converting heat to the mechanical energy of the winds. So the SST is like the temperature of the engine. If the hotter it is, the better it is, the more energy that there is. The exhaust temperature, if it's cold, if you have more energy conversion. And the fuel is like the surface enthalpy flux, adding fuel to the engine to burn. The drag coefficient is like an inefficiency of the engine, which needs to be low to get a high intensity. So if we look at the potential intensity, that's in red on the right that we calculate from this using the sail drone data. And the observed 10-meter winds is in black. And you can see that it's pretty close to the maximum intensity, the maximum possible intensity theoretically that it could have reached. So with that, we can look at the impact from our 1D model output. We can look at the impact that salinity had on the potential intensity. And we do that by taking the red. So the red curve on the top is the actual potential intensity. The gray is using the SST and enthalpy flux from the model, the 1D model output with no salinity stratification. So there's a decrease in potential intensity because there's more SST cooling. And the green is if we just held SST constant at the value before the core of the storm came through. And of course, there's more intensity because there's no ocean feedback. SST is not cooling at all. The bottom plot shows the difference between the red and the gray and the red and the green. So with no salinity stratification in the core of the hurricane, the strongest winds, it reduces the potential intensity about up to 4 meters per second. And this is stronger than actually if we just ignored the SST feedback completely, which is the constant SST curve. It's only about 2 meters per second max. So this says that in the core of the hurricane, at least the salinity impact had a bigger impact on the potential intensity than the total SST cooling. The SST cooling from everything else, which really was maximum kind of after the storm passed, it tended to reduce the intensity. All right, so that was looking at kind of the transfer of energy, heat energy from the ocean, the warm ocean, to the hurricane. And now we'll look at the opposite effect, kind of the ability of the ocean to slow down the hurricane's winds through the drag, which is parameterized through a drag coefficient. So the drag coefficient is kind of what translates the mean winds at 10 meters on the right to the wind stress, or the turbulent momentum flux, tau on the left, and the rho is air density. So we can measure all of these black terms here with the sail drone data directly, where the wind stress is calculated from the covariance wind measurements. And the reason here, I showed this earlier, but the motivation is that there's a lot of uncertainty in the drag coefficient in hurricane force winds. So we wanted to see what the sail drone data tell us about that. And so we'll make an approximation, which is that the total wind stress, tau, equals the turbulent wind stress. So the turbulent wind stress is what we can calculate directly from the sail drone using the Reynolds average. So this is we use 5-minute averages, so the primes are deviations from the 5-minute mean, the horizontal and vertical wind, and the overbar is the 5-minute average. So that's the turbulent wind stress. And I'll discuss this a little bit more later. It's not exactly equal to the total wind stress, but for now we'll assume it is, so we can calculate the wind stress. And we use 20 hertz data for this from the sail drone. And I told you there's a lot going on inside the hurricane, a lot of rolling, a lot of heaving of the sail drone vehicle. So we use only data where the vehicle roll is greater than 20 degrees, eliminate data with roll higher than that because we're unsure of the data quality. So that eliminates a little more than half of the data when the wind speeds are high, greater than 30 meters per second. And I'll show you an example here of kind of the complications of these measurements inside a major hurricane. If I can get this video to work. So this is inside the eye wall, inside the northern eye wall of the hurricane, and I'll go up. So there's going to be once in the strongest winds here, you'll see the sail drone will kind of get torqued around, and then there's a big wave that crashes on it. So this is kind of what we want to avoid. We don't want to use, because here it comes. There's a big, crashing wave, right? So we don't want to. We probably don't want to use this data when we're making our calculations. So that's why we eliminate the data when the vehicle is rolling a lot. Okay, so this shows time series of the turbulent wind stress. So this is calculated directly from the sail drone, the turbulent wind stress on the left. And you can clearly see the Hurricane Sam, the wind stress goes up a lot and tends to be strongest when the winds are strongest. The red colors there indicate the strongest winds. And on the right, it's a little more interesting, the drag coefficient. There are high values when the winds are very weak, which is known to happen. That's a well-known occurrence. Then when it got into Hurricane Sam, the kind of the moderate winds, so around 30 meters per second or so, which are the green and the yellow colors, the drag coefficient actually is the highest for the about 30 meter per second winds, and then it decreases. The drag coefficient is lower when the winds are strongest in the core of the hurricane, and then the drag coefficient increases again. So the red colors here are about 40 meters per second or more, 40, 50 meters per second. So this is another way to look at it. If we look at the 10-meter wind speed on the x-axis and the drag coefficient on the y-axis, you can see again the drag coefficient is higher for very weak winds. and it increases again as winds go up to about 30 meters per second. And here are these large values that I mentioned, around 30 meters per second, and then it decreases as winds get stronger. So the right plot shows kind of a bin averaged version of this, which clearly shows the increase in drag coefficient, and then a pretty sharp decrease as winds get higher than 30 meters per second. And this agrees somewhat with previous studies. So this plot on the top right, which shows especially the red and the black curves using data in the front quadrants of other hurricanes, where they show peaks in the drag coefficient around 30 to 35 meters per second, and then decreases, sometimes dramatic decreases, as winds get up to 50 meters per second. And so I like this paper, Foltz et al. I think I like this quote that they had in that paper, so I reproduced it here. And so at surface wind speeds, so this is trying to explain, why this is happening, why the drag coefficient goes up and then back down. At surface wind speeds of 40 meters per second, the streaks of foam and spray merge into a whiteout, and the roughness begins to decrease. And then the roughness reduces to virtually zero by 80 meters per second, earning the surface aerodynamically extremely smooth and cross swell. So that's when the wind is not in the same direction as the swells, which is dominant in large regions of the hurricanes, allows the roughness under high wind conditions to increase considerably before it reduces. And this is shown graphically on the right, where the green is taken from the front left quadrant of the hurricane. And you can see a big increase in drag coefficient and then a decrease. And then the red and the blue are kind of to the right of the storm and behind it, and they show a much lower drag coefficient. So the sail drone was kind of out in front of the storm at first, kind of in the front left, and then and that's when the drag coefficient was very high, which is consistent. And then it was to the east of the storm center, and the drag coefficient was very low when the winds were strong. So that's kind of the red and the blue thoughts. So I think it could have been kind of an average of these overall, which gives the increase and then the decrease. But we're still, this is kind of preliminary. We're still working on sorting out all the sail drone data and figuring out, the best quality control and which data is reliable and not. But so far it seems at least somewhat consistent with some other results. So this is kind of a video that kind of shows this, I think, to some extent. So if we go up, let's see, 20. So here winds are 50 miles per hour. So this is like tropical storm force winds, and you can see the ocean looks pretty rough. It's a well-defined air-sea interface. There's not a lot of wave crashing, not a lot of sea spray. So you might think the drag coefficient would be rougher here out in the front quadrant of the hurricane. Probably the winds are coming against this, maybe against the swells a little bit. And then here when the winds get stronger, let's see, go up to the strongest winds. Now you see lots of foam, lots of sea spray, almost whiteout conditions, a lot of breaking waves. So probably makes sense that the drag coefficient would be lower in this case. It's a smoother, aerodynamically smoother surface, and the winds looks like it's going with the swells. So potentially a lower drag coefficient here, even though the winds are very strong. And okay, so one more thing. I mentioned that it's not exactly true that the total wind stress, which is what we relate to the drag coefficient here, this tau on the left, it's not completely true that it equals the turbulent wind stress, which is what we calculated from the high resolution sail drone data, because there's a term that's related to the waves, the surface waves, and a wind stress related to the viscosity. But the viscosity is only important very close to the ocean surface, so we can ignore it. The wave stress could be larger, and I've shown an example. And overall, the wind stress is pretty consistent. It doesn't change much with altitude, with height in the boundary layer. So that's the total tau is pretty much a constant. So as an example, this is a lab study that looked at wind blowing over waves, and it shows the total horizontal velocity decomposed into the mean plus the wave-induced horizontal velocity perturbations plus the turbulent perturbations on the right. And you can see there are these coherent velocity perturbations here with the waves. So the wind tends to be stronger on the windward side of the wave crest and weaker in the leeward side in the trough. And that can cause a turbulent momentum flux in addition to the turbulent flux that we see on the right, which is what we calculated from the sail drone data. But the scales here are a lot different. The scale for the turbulent flux goes up a lot higher than the color scale is higher than the wave-induced flux. So we don't think it's a huge impact on the total wind stress, but it's something that definitely needs to be considered. So it could increase the drag coefficient estimates potentially. And this is another study, and it shows the wave-induced turbulent flux, momentum flux, divided by the total wind stress with a turbulent momentum flux. And they found that it's somewhere between about 10 and 50%, which is not a huge number. And this is as a function of height. So it's the height above the water divided by the wavelength of the dominant waves. And for the sail drone, it's about at the red line. It's pretty close to the ocean surface, and the waves were large, long wavelength. So it was kind of in where you'd expect the wave-induced momentum flux to be important, but it might introduce a 10 to 50% correction on the drag coefficient. But if we go up and look at the drag coefficient, so it's probably not going to qualitatively change the drag coefficient versus wind speed, but it could make the drag coefficient a little higher, especially for high wind speeds. But that needs more work. This is only preliminary analysis at this point. So basically, we need more measurements. If we can get more direct measurements like this and combine them with the total wind stress calculations from something like dropsondes, for example, that would be extremely valuable to try to figure this out in more detail. All right, so summary, we had a successful test of a new extreme weather sail drone in 125-mile-an-hour plus winds and waves of up to 90 feet. So this was very encouraging that it was able to survive, and it returned high-quality, high-resolution data in real time. We also did a successful coordination of the sail drones with underwater gliders, getting co-located measurements. We observed surface ocean warming under the core of a Category 4 hurricane, which was kind of unexpected. Preliminary results with the drag coefficient, the turbulent momentum flux, show a maximum at about 30 meters per second, and then a decrease. So this is consistent with some other studies. And there are possible links to wind and wave direction. And it could be interesting to look at wave model output. We don't have wave direction from the sail drone. So if we could look at some kind of wave model and compare and try to figure out why the drag coefficient changed potentially, that could be interesting. And for the future, so I think now that we know that this works, that the sail drones can survive a Category 4 hurricane and all the sensors work, I think there's just a lot of possibilities for what else we can do. We don't have subsurface temperature and salinity on the sail drones, so it's important to have other measurements from things like gliders and floats, and potentially getting subsurface temperature salinity from the sail drones in the future. It'd be really interesting to have carbon dioxide, CO2, ocean CO2 sensors to try to figure out if during hurricanes the ocean is the source or a sink of CO2. Vertical wind profiles would be very exciting to have, like I mentioned, to calculate the total wind stress above the sea surface and compare it to the turbulent wind stress calculated from the sail drones. So that would take some engineering developments, getting something like LiDAR to work on an autonomous vehicle like that. And of course, it's always a challenge, getting sustained funding to try to do this and expand and make more progress. But so OMAO, the Weather Program Office, Ocean Portfolio, PMEL, and AOML have contributed a lot. So thanks, and hopefully we can keep doing this in the future. So the ongoing work that we're doing is the direct momentum flux, the drag coefficient. We can also calculate it from the ADCP data, potentially, the momentum balance in the ocean, figuring out what the drag coefficient is. So we can try that. We're comparing the sail drone data to forecast models to see how well the models do. We are combining the sail drone, glider, and aircraft observations to do analysis from this past hurricane season. And we're working with the Hurricane Center, who will be involved in our planning, hopefully, during this upcoming season, the 2022 sail drone mission. Hopefully we'll have them involved during our weekly meetings to help plan that and give us advice on where to position the sail drones. And we're working with EMC to get the data, test the data in their forecast models, and hopefully eventually get it assimilated into them in real time. So the plan, finally, the plan for this upcoming hurricane season is shown on the left. We would like to ideally expand and coordinate with uncrewed aerial systems deployed from the P3s. That's Joe Sion's work. And that would be exciting to have the atmospheric boundary layer with the air-sea interface with the subsurface ocean measured by ocean gliders, all co-located at the same time. In addition to expendables like AXBTs and dropsondes deployed from aircraft. So that's kind of our goal going forward into this year and hopefully beyond. So we have, for this upcoming season so far, we have funding for 4 sail drones, so 1 for 90 days and then 3 for 47 days. And that's only about half of what we had last year. We had 5 sail drones for 90 days. So hopefully, with some more funding, we can get back to where we were last year. And also potentially we'd like to put one in the Gulf of Mexico, which of course is a very, very important region for hurricanes potentially making landfall. So with that, I will end, and I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has.